Listen, you got to come see us when you come to New York, VP Biden.
I will.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
It don't have nothing to do with Trump. It has to do with the fact I want something for my community. I would love to see.
Take a look at my record, man.
So that clip came at the end of a Joe Biden interview with Charlemagne on The Breakfast Club. And the rest of the interview honestly wasn't too bad. But, you know, in Joe Biden, in of course Joe Biden fashion, he couldn't help himself but to have a gaffe at the end and just say something totally crazy. Besides the fact that he was mildly racist, he continues with his statement, the tradition of Democrats who view Black Americans and the minorities in general as just one solid voting bloc without individual perspectives and points of view. Totally devoid of individual thought, whose mostly working class votes are a sure thing. The real question though is where he finds the nerve to think that he's so down with the African American community. I'm sorry, Mr. Biden, you're not. Tim Scott of South Carolina, mind you, he's the only black Republican senator. He released a comment on Twitter regarding the Joe Biden gaffe, and he said, quote, Joe Biden has a history of saying dehumanizing things when it comes to black Americans. He also said, quote, 1.3 black Americans have already voted for Trump in 2016. This morning, Joe Biden told every single one of us, we ain't black. Joe Biden said he'd be willing to put his record against Trump's. And so I did some research, and I want to stick to the facts here. In 1984, Senator Joe Biden championed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which among other things created mandatory minimums and enacted stricter sentencing for marijuana offenses. In 1986, he voted for the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which imposed harsher sentences for crack than powder cocaine. In 1994, he was one of the architects behind the Violent Crime Control Law Enforcement Act, which essentially was the foundation for the mass incarceration that was to follow in the coming decades. Remember when school districts were trying to desegregate too, as a part of the civil rights movement? Yeah, Joe Biden was against that too. In 1975, Joe Biden supported an anti-busing measure offered by State Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. In 1976, he introduced a proposal that blocked the Justice Department from seeking busing as a desegregation tool. Joe Biden has said of his ties to racist members of Congress that they had to tolerate them to get work done. Of busing segregation, Biden has said in his defense that integrating the busing system would have put undue stress on black communities. As always, you come to your own conclusions on this. Now, I'm far from a Trump supporter, but I'd like to take this opportunity and do as Mr. Biden has asked and put his record against Mr. Trump's. Have you ever heard of the First Step Act? Probably not. And that's with good reason, because the mainstream media makes sure that anything that Trump does that could be perceived as being well received by the general public doesn't get a lot of press. The act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in 2019. Among other things, the First Step Act reduces mandatory minimums, it gets rid of the 3-strike rules, it eases sentencing on drug-related incidents, and it even creates a program whereby nonviolent offenders can create credits to get out of jail a little earlier. In other words, Trump's legislation totally unravels the draconian legislation that Biden championed in the 80s and 90s that devastated minority communities, especially the African American community, and really only served to benefit the interest of the privatized prison industrial complex. So really, I'd like to end this video by thanking Joe Biden. Thank you, Mr. Biden, for reminding me, a minority, of your history of legislation and the fact that you were the champion behind legislation that targeted people who look like me and came from the same communities that I come from.
It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. Young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity